Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. My name is Karl Simon. I'm with the U.S. EPA, and I have the enviable task, along with a number of my colleagues at the agency, of actually implementing this rule of which we've been talking about. And it is, in many ways, a very interesting law, and in many ways, one that we'll be interpreting for many years here. So I want to spend a little bit of time just going through some of the basics, point out a couple of things. I'm not going to spend time going through a survey because I'm the last speaker here, and I think you all understand the program. But what I've found as I've given this talk over the years is that there are still some basic misunderstandings on how the programs work. So use the slides as a reference point here too. So if we can go to the next one. Next one, please. We'll walk through, and just a real basic in terms of what we need to look at. The point I think to take off of this slide is that this law, for the first time for us, told us to do life cycle assessment, and the life cycle assessment for looking at each renewable fuel category looks at direct emissions and significant indirect emissions, such as significant emissions from land use changes. Now, that may not be very artfully drafted, but it's a fairly broad statement and has been the subject of an awful lot of thinking by the agency and our experts at the agency, but also a number of people that have been helping us interpret that and implement that provision. Next slide, please. Just to break down the familiar category of the breakdown of the fuels between biomass-based diesel, cellulosic biofuel, advanced biofuel, and generally renewable biofuel, which is everything else. A couple of points to think about when you're thinking about volumes, and the volumes are all based on 2022, 36 billion gallon number. One is that the cellulosic biofuel is adjusted or can be adjusted every year. We've been doing that the last couple of years. So there is an annual assessment process that takes place. If we actually adjust those volumes, which we have in the past, we have the opportunity, but we don't have to, adjust both total and advanced biofuel numbers as well. Secondly, one other point is that the grandfathering provision. So there is a provision that Congress put in place that basically said any facilities that were built or in the process of being built prior to enactment of the law, which was December 19, 2007, especially for corn, primarily for corn-based ethanol, are grandfathered. What does that mean in a practical sense? That means that there's effectively, depending on who's counting, somewhere between 14 and 17 billion gallons of corn ethanol production that it does not need to meet any of the life cycle requirements. They're grandfathered in under the law. Next slide. We went through, and when we did the final rule, we did some adoptions based on certain assumptions of how the fuel pool would look in 2022 in terms of impacts. You can see that we did looked at both reductions in amount of gasoline and diesel consumption fuel, because the program, we focus a lot on corn ethanol and biodiesel. Other applicable transportation fuels can be jet fuel, in some instances home heating oil, fuel going into locomotives, for example. So there's lots of other places where the fuel can go besides somebody's gas tank as well. So we did some assessments there. Looked at energy security benefits. It was referenced there, so we came up with some numbers. Life cycle assessment, we estimated roughly 140 million metric tons when the program's fully implemented. Did try to look at some ag and sector and related impacts, and then I'm going to spend some time on the emissions and air quality impacts in a few slides. We did go through, and let me take a few minutes to talk about the life cycle modeling approach, because this was the subject of a fair amount of discussion and public comment when we went through the rule adoption. We spent a lot of time thinking about how to implement the requirement that Congress gave us. So we looked at things such as agricultural sector modeling. We spend a lot of time looking at that. International agri-sector modeling. Data, maybe, I think we have, with a lot of help from our colleagues at USDA, I think there's a lot of information out there on the U.S. agricultural sector modeling. International becomes a little more interesting. There's still a lot of work that's been done, but probably, we can certainly do more. Looking at both the processing in terms of how that plays out. So how does fuel get processed, and what are the impacts associated with processing it? Different energy sources going to make ethanol, for example, if it's using electricity off the grid or generating electricity from captured biogas, that has an impact. And then a fairly simple subject for us is land use change modeling, and that trying to figure out what the land use impacts are, not only if you provide a shock to a system to say you're going to get more corn ethanol or more biodiesel, what happens in the resulting sphere of land use, both here domestically as well as internationally. We spent, as I said, we spent a significant amount of time with USDA's help and with DOE's help to try to come up with this process. We try to use the most up-to-date assessments we can in recognizing the rulemaking process that we work under on a regular basis, along with public comment and transparency. We went through a 120-day comment period on our methodology. We had a 2-day workshop to detail the methodology, and on top of that, we went through an independent peer review, checking the 4 questions that you can see here, to give us the best information we can to put together the basic structure that we've been using for both the rulemaking since 2010, but also subsequent assessments. Just a summary of kind of what are the available pathways now. There's a table in the regulations called Table 1. I won't make everybody read that, but this is kind of the plain English version of that table. So you can see a fair amount of diversity from the approved pathways already, and you can see the numbers there are where they fall in one of those 4 categories. We're actually doing more. So the one of the many things we've learned as we've gone through this program is never underestimate the ingenuity of the American or international business community in terms of trying to find ways to make fuels out of anything. It's been nothing short of amazing, and sometimes you have to scratch your head at the questions that we get for people that are bringing various feedstocks in and saying, can they make a renewable fuel out of it? So we have an ongoing list of about 30 different petitions that we get for people trying to make biodiesel or cellulosic fuel out of different things, or they have unique energy processes that they want to incorporate into their ethanol plant, for example, to make a biofuel. And we have to go through a public process generally to do that assessment. Let me briefly talk about the air quality assessment what we did and put it in context. So we did in 2010, we looked at a 2022 impact of the 36 billion gallons relative to what was the existing biofuel program at the time. So there was a requirement for 7.5 billion gallons of ethanol, which is such a quaint number now thinking about it and it's only been relatively short period of time. Most of that fuel was assumed to be ethanol. We looked at a mix of E10 and E85. So E15 was not an option at the moment. That came later. So we had to make an assessment. We assumed actually a fair amount to be E85, and you can judge as to whether that's appropriate or not. But we thought it was the best assessment given the data we had before us. We looked at the methodologies, looked at emissions on vehicles, productions of feedstock, fuel production, distribution. So tried to take kind of the downstream and upstream approach to this. We used CMAQ, the photochemical model that we use for a lot of our air quality assessments, to take those emissions inventories and translate them into kind of, and I'll show you a map here to what it actually means for some of the ozone impacts as well. Just as a summary, and I think you've heard some of these through the last couple of days, some go up, some go down. Hydrocarbons, NOx, acetaldehyde, and ethanol go up. Carbon monoxide, benzene, 1,3-butadiene go down generally. We did do an assessment based on, again, on the facts and the fuel assessments that we had at the time. So the pathway that we chose to model, we did come up with some increased PM and tried to translate that into some premature mortality numbers. So we did put out a number of 245 cases. And again, that was based on the emissions impacts from the vehicles that we knew that we understood at the time, as well as the assessment on both the health impacts, but also where we thought the fuel mix would be. This was the chart that we put out to show roughly the ozone impacts, and you can see that Fair amount across the country in terms of increases. Some were decreases, and that would be obviously because of some, if some areas had different needs from a NOx or VOC perspective, depending on what the impact would be. So we did actually we were able to show and translate what we thought would be those impacts. But it is, as you can see from the colors on the map, highly variable across the country. Air toxics, similar variation, I think you'd see. No real surprises, I don't think, in the air toxics. Again, you'd expect some change in acetaldehydes, but also you had some offsets going on as well, too, so we've tried to lay that out in our assessments. This is, I think, something to work for, and when Dr. Cousins was asking me a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the slides, I think this is an important thing for the Institute potentially and the members to pay attention to is shortly, hopefully this spring, we've been spending a lot of time with DOE and the Coordinating Research Council doing an update to our emissions assessment from vehicles. So there was a really, I think, a well-done study that has a significant amount of data that we'll be putting out. We've gone through a lot of review on this, statistical modeling, whole different range of fuel parameters that it's looking at. So it'll be very helpful in updating, I think, everybody's understanding of what the potential impacts are from ethanol and different blends on motor vehicle emissions. And obviously that data point, a very important data point, gets translated down as we look at benefits of and assessments on different fuel scenarios going forward. Separately, Congress decided when we did the rule that it would be helpful to concurrently or at some point down the road do what's known as in slang an anti-backsliding study to basically see that the numbers that Congress was putting in place for the standards, what is that assessment? What is the impact on air quality from putting all this new biofuel or renewable fuel into the marketplace? So we're in process of doing that, and we're updating some of the analysis that we put out 2 years ago, but also trying to use new tools and to try to get that process. That's on a longer time frame, and I don't have an issuance date at the moment for that. But that, I think, should help expand the state of understanding as to how, on some of the impacts on renewable fuels in this country. And with that, our website actually is pretty good on this one. There's a lot of good information out there for being able to find out different rules and regulations, but also the work that we've done behind it, as well as we do monthly number updates. So if anybody wants to know how much cellulosic biofuel was produced in January, you can go find that number. And with that, thank you.